We begin with the latest from the conflict in Ukraine. Russian authorities from the Belgorod region have asked residents of two border villages to evacuate. The homes in the area are situated very close to Ukraine, and an attack on Monday spurred the urgent warning. This comes after one person was killed and four others wounded after Ukraine shelled a checkpoint in a Russian village bordering the Kharkov region in Ukraine. Here are some images of the aftermath of the attack. The victim was an elderly woman and a Ukrainian refugee. Three of those wounded were also Ukrainian citizens who have recently fled to Russia. Hundreds of Ukrainian refugees are now coming to Russia after Ukrainian forces have taken over a number of towns in the Kharkov region. Local authorities say they are provided with all the necessary care and will be given temporary housing. That's as the Ukrainian government is persecuting local teachers in the Kharkov region. Kiev's deputy prime minister said Ukrainian teachers who have taught children in accordance with the Russian curriculum will now face criminal charges and could spend up to 12 years in prison. Former U.S. Marine Corps intelligence officer Scott Ritter says the West is ignoring human rights abuses perpetrated by the Ukrainian government against its Russian-speaking population while it tries to create an image of a democratic Ukraine.
The U.S. ignored what happened in Odessa. The U.S. ignored the brutal assault on Mariupol, on the assault on the Donbass. The U.S. ignored 8 years of shelling and slaughtering of Ukrainian civilians, Russian-speaking Ukrainian civilians in the Donbass region. So the U.S. is going to ignore what's going on today in the recently recaptured territories. They call it filtration, but it's really murder. They're targeting people for murder, reprisals. The lucky ones will only go to prison for 15 years. But many of them aren't going to get the chance to go to prison. They're being killed right now as we speak. But the U.S. ignores it because the U.S. has bought into this fantasy of Ukraine as a free and democratic society. There's nothing free or democratic about Ukraine. The current Ukrainian government, the U.S. has bought into the notion that there isn't a Nazi problem in Ukraine. Well, the people who are murdering the Russians right now in Izium and in the other recaptured villages and towns are Nazis. The Kraken Battalion. What do they think that is? IDAR. What do they think that is?
Now, this whole influx of refugees was triggered recently when Kiev's military forces took back control of a number of towns in the Kharkov region. We'll bring you a moving map now here on the program. As Russia withdrew its troops from Ukraine's northeast region, redeploying them southward and that of the Donetsk Republic down here to bolster defenses. Here's part of the former contact line for you on the map. Now, meantime, Kiev has retaken the key cities of Kharkov, Balakleya, and Izium as well, as we understand now, with claims of threats being made against anyone who cooperated with Russia.
All collaborators, all Russian specialists who come to Ukraine, all Russian officials, teachers, kindergarten workers should know that they are criminals and that there will be no sympathy towards them. Otherwise, either death or prison awaits them.
Collaborators must pay the maximum price, either legally or physically, in terms of combat.
Now, fears about Ukrainian action in the reclaimed territories have been growing after the country's deputy prime minister said some Russian teachers there had already been arrested. Apparently, they could face 12 years behind bars. Now, the head of the Kharkov region's civil military administration claims the Ukrainian army and foreign powers have turned many towns into lawless zones.
We are now receiving concrete information that looting and killings by the armed forces of Ukraine is out of control in a number of towns. All this is done under the control of Western intelligence agencies. We've received information that mercenaries are driving around Kupiansk and shooting people.
We spoke earlier in the program to veteran war correspondent Thomas Roper. He believes Kiev is violating human rights. He also says the West is actually turning a blind eye.
Everybody who is working with the Russians in these territories has to be afraid of consequences now from Kiev. Teachers, whatever, somebody who's working in a city administration just for, I don't know, providing the city with electricity. They are all, in the eyes of Kiev, collaborators. And if we think this till the end, this means they would, well, I don't know, maybe half of the population would be in prison after that. So these crazy laws are enforced already for weeks. If they talk about death, then we are talking about just uncontrolled shooting in the street of these cities, what I even hear from some victims. On the other hand, I don't know any example which says it's comparable with human rights, that you get prison for receiving another citizenship. So I don't see that there's any civilized explanation for this kind of behavior or this kind of announcements. We have so many things which are happening in Ukraine, and the Western press is just not mentioning it at all. It's a tragedy, but that we see any reaction from Western countries, I don't have any clue and any hint that this might happen. We have seen this in the last 8 years. The West is very good in closing his eyes.
Meanwhile, several videos showing Western mercenaries reportedly helping Ukrainian troops take back control of local settlements have emerged online. Have a look.
Hey boys, where the are we? That's a lot of fighting to get here. What just happened to your rifle?
Got shot. That's the exit.
Although Washington says recent successes by Ukrainian troops on the front line have been the result of Western support and guidance. Kiev says the backing of its partners have been pivotal to its advance.
Clearly, we've seen significant progress by the Ukrainians, particularly in the northeast, and that is a product, as I said, of the support we provided, but first and foremost, it's a product of the extraordinary courage and resilience of the Ukrainian armed forces and the Ukrainian people.
Without this support, we will not be able to return our lands, and I recognize that myself, and I'm quite candid about this.
Meanwhile, U.S. Senator Mark Warner says American intelligence is working closely with Kiev, providing important information. Our guest, Scott Ritter, again adds that Washington's plans to weaken Russia in this conflict have been obvious from the beginning, with Ukraine being used as a means to an end.
We've seen a transition where we're talking about a NATO army. The army that's fighting Russia right now in Ukraine is no longer a Ukrainian army. It's a NATO army. It just happens to be manned by Ukrainian troops primarily. But these Ukrainian troops are supported by NATO intelligence, by NATO communications, by NATO command staffs, by NATO logistics. And there's reports that, hundreds, if not thousands of former military specialists are contracted to the Ukrainian military to do specialist tasks such as operate or advise on the operation of advanced NATO artillery systems and things of that nature. So already that's crossed the boundary. But now what we see too is this international legion that has always been in this fight. It used to be sort of a joke, a bunch of fat former veterans, many with no combat experience, and the Ukrainians didn't want to use them. But the International Legion has been transformed, and it now is manned by thousands of very combat savvy international mercenaries. The U.S., frankly, it doesn't care about Ukraine. What it cares about is doing as much damage to Russia as possible, and they're using the Ukrainian conflict to achieve that goal and objective.
Meanwhile, our correspondent in the Donbass spoke with a captured Ukrainian soldier who says he was fighting alongside foreign mercenaries who found the wartime action shocking. Here's RT's Roman Kosarov with more on the story.
According to open source reports, scores of NATO instructors have descended on Ukraine over the last 8 or so years in order to train Ukrainian army to combat Donetsk and Lugansk people's armies. Also, over this period of time, thousands of foreign mercenaries have joined various nationalist battalions of Ukraine who have been active in war crimes against civilians in Donetsk and Lugansk. Now, some of those mercenaries have already been caught and convicted to death by local courts for their actions. Now, some of them are still at large. Some of them have deserted their positions. Now, earlier I spoke with one prisoner of war of the Ukrainian army here in Donetsk. The man's name is Daniil Onoprienko. He speaks English really well. He spent some time in the United States, so he was very active in speaking to these foreign mercenaries who were in his battalion. This is his story.
These men were Americans. If you can look closely, you can see the American flag patches on their chests. Honestly speaking, in great measure, they influenced us only in raising morale. They lifted up our fighting spirits, but how effective they actually were, I cannot say. Some men even deserted their positions. Our position was the hottest spot in the war, if we do not include Mariupol. We were in Kiev. They said that they didn't need this. After that, we never saw them again. There was also a situation when, as soon as these men arrived, we had to get up in the morning due to the shooting and gunfire. We sat there and they looked at us with open eyes filled with panic, asking what was happening. Then they realized this is a real war. They had a machine gun and they broke it. They broke it so they could retreat. That was such a fiasco for us. They took such an expensive piece of equipment and they just took an axe and broke it in two. Then they just retreated 50 meters and sat there. To speak honestly, nobody in our command told us anything about any kind of foreign formations that were supposed to be with us or what they were going to do. Officially, they said that the reason for their presence, as many of them are actual soldiers who fought in the war in Afghanistan, is that they're fighting for democracy. This British guy said that they came to protect democracy. They came to share their experience with us. They came to create some kind of influence.
So to conclude, Daniil Onoprienko was not really impressed with those mercenaries who he had come across, and he wasn't impressed with their weapons either, as they were all seeking Soviet-made Kalashnikovs.